Hey heroes, welcome to another amazing episode of History of the Marvel Universe. The topic of this week's episode was a runner-up in one of our patron polls. If you would like to support the channel and vote as well, then you can sign up for as little as $1 per month over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelate. The link is in the description below along with my various social medias. This week's tale is really the story of three men, beginning in the first half of the 20th century. Firstly, there was an American reporter named Kevin Marlow, better known by his nickname Keen. Secondly, there was a British nobleman named Brian Falsworth, who was no stranger to the unusual. His father, James Montgomery Falsworth, fought as the masked government operative Union Jack during the First World War. Finally, there was Brian's best friend and secret lover, Englishman Roger Aubrey. The story here really begins in 1938 when British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was making agreements to avoid war with Nazi Germany. Preferring a pacifistic approach, Brian Falsworth supported these policies while his father believed that Adolf Hitler needed to be stopped. Soon a rift formed between them and Brian left his family home with Roger remaining by his side. In 1939, the two visited Berlin to show their support for appeasement, where Hitler was more than happy to rub elbows with the son of a British lord and use him for propaganda. Brian and Roger were evidently unaware of the evil brewing beneath their noses, but then over the following year, the Second World War broke out in earnest. In the early days of the war, the two men decided to return home to Britain. However, they were stopped by the Gestapo, who didn't want to risk them publicly reversing their pro-appeasement stance. Brian attempted to fight back but was overpowered and imprisoned, saved from execution only by his noble blood. Roger, meanwhile, was turned over to Project Crusader, one of the several clandestine programs the Nazis were running in their attempts to create superhuman agents. This point is where our other protagonist, American reporter Keen Marlow, enters the picture. In late 1940, Marlow arrived in Hamburg, Germany, with the task of investigating the conditions in Nazi prisons. He was denied access but decided to sneak inside and see for himself what was being hidden from the public. However, he was soon imprisoned himself and tortured after being accused of espionage. He was subsequently locked up alongside none other than Brian Falsworth. And the two men soon had another cellmate, a brilliant German biochemist named Erich Schmidt. Schmidt had been working on a super soldier serum based on the one created by Abraham Erskine. The dying scientist gave the only sample of his formula to the two men, urging them to keep it out of Nazi hands. Believing Schmidt's last words, Falsworth and Marlow both decided to drink his concoction. Endowed with superhuman strength, the two men made their escape, freeing other prisoners on the way out. They vowed to use their strength to continue striking against the Nazi menace, and created the costumed identity of the Destroyer. The two men shared this guise, operating simultaneously while posing as the same man to confuse and confound their enemies. Their scheme worked well, but this also resulted in conflicting reports regarding the Destroyer's origin and identity. Some accounts indicate that Falsworth was the Destroyer, implying that Marlow never existed. Others that Marlow not only existed but continued operating as the Destroyer for decades after the war in a series of largely undocumented adventures. One story states that Keen Marlow was simply an alias used by Falsworth to enter Germany undercover. Another that Marlow was the first Destroyer and that Falsworth obtained Schmidt's formula later from a different prisoner. It's even possible that Marlow's adventures as the Destroyer are completely fabricated, existing only as fictitious stories. For the time being, all we can really say for sure is that Brian Falsworth did canonically take the serum and became the Destroyer, whereas stories involving Marlow can be taken with a grain of salt. Regardless of who wore the costume at any given time, the destroyer fought against the Third Reich behind enemy lines. He endeavored to free those interned in concentration camps, the stripes of their prison uniforms reflecting those on his own. One of Marlow's earliest foes as the destroyer was a Nazi scientist known simply as the Scar, who turned his death ray against German civilians who threatened to rise up against their Nazi oppressors. One of Scar's victims was the father of a woman named Florence von Ward, who subsequently allied with the destroyer. They plotted against the Scar, who seemingly met his end in a fight with the destroyer. During this time, Marlow revealed his true identity to Florence, who also adopted an alias, Flora von Banger. The two subsequently grew closer and before long were engaged to be married. While Marlow and Florence defeated the likes of Dr. Dragon and Mouse the Manhunter, Brian Falsworth plunged into the Terror Den and battled the goblins within. Meanwhile, Brian's best friend and lover, Roger Aubrey, was subjected to Nazi experiments that reduced him to only 12 centimeters in height. He awakened with no memory of who he was or what had happened, and soon found himself allied with a British man named William Leese, better known as Alfie. In February of 1942, Alfie assembled the British-based superhero team, the Crusaders, and the amnesiac Roger joined under the name Dynamite. However, Alfie was secretly a Nazi agent who was manipulating the others as part of a plot to publicly assassinate King George VI. This scheme largely revolved around the Crusaders replacing the primarily American super team, the Invaders, as the King's honor guard, so they wouldn't be able to prevent this regicide. Ironically, it was the Invaders' own British member Spitfire who facilitated this decision, arguing that it made more sense for her countrymen to be the ones protecting their king. Furthermore, Spitfire was actually Brian Falsworth's sister, Jacqueline. In any event, it was Dynamite who discovered Alfie's true allegiance and escaped to warn the Invaders. In the end, the assassination attempt was thwarted, and the Crusaders felt like fools for being manipulated by a fascist. More importantly, for today's story anyway, Jacqueline and her father, Montgomery, both recognized Roger, giving them hope that Brian was alive as well. Sure enough, their ally, Captain America, soon encountered and joined forces with Brian on a mission in Germany. The FBI evidently suspected Keen Marlow of being the destroyer, but Brian claimed that this theory was false and revealed his face to the good captain. The two men then worked together to rescue a captive American soldier who knew about Project Rebirth, the super soldier program that created Captain America. They subsequently traveled to Berlin, where several of the invaders were being held prisoner. But in the ensuing battle, Captain America was captured and the destroyer was seemingly killed in an explosion. This was witnessed by Roger Aubrey as Dynamite, Jacqueline Falsworth as Spitfire, and Montgomery Falsworth, the retired Union Jack. They'd come to Germany searching for a way to restore Roger's memory and were unaware that the destroyer they saw was their beloved Brian. But the revelations they sought soon came after they were discovered by a group of Nazis. Spitfire and Dynamite fought off their attackers, one of whom was the officer who sent Roger to be experimented on by Project Crusader. Recognizing this man, Roger Aubrey interrogated him to learn what happened, causing his memory to begin returning. But they also learned that the destroyer who they'd just seemingly witnessed explode was Brian Falsworth. The distraught trio were then surprised and knocked out by sleeping gas. Jacqueline was placed with the other invaders who were being prepared for execution. However, Montgomery and Roger were rescued by Brian, who'd survived the earlier blast and slipped away in the confusion. Abandoning the destroyer identity, Brian instead donned his father's old costume to become the second Union Jack. Of course, the first order of business was to rescue his sister and the other invaders, which he accomplished handily. Roger, meanwhile, retrieved Captain America's stolen shield from Hitler himself. As Union Jack, Bryan became a member of the Invaders alongside Spitfire and Captain America. Roger and Montgomery, meanwhile, interrogated the captive Colonel Dietrich until he revealed how to restore Roger to normal size. He ended up growing even larger and stronger than he was before his shrinking, and decided to adopt the Destroyer identity for himself. But rather than joining the Invaders, he wished to continue Bryan's mission by fighting Axis forces behind enemy lines. As for the other Destroyer, Keen Marlow, there are reports indicating that he was active during this time as well. He used a series of aliases and cover identities, notable among them being a German writer named Louis Kramer. In this guise, he was recruited by a Nazi agent, Inga von Lech, to impersonate the Destroyer and stage a phony prison break as part of a scheme to lure in the real Destroyer. Amused by the irony, Marlow played along, taking the opportunity to free more actual prisoners. Aubrey had less luck in his initial missions and was defeated and captured by the Nazi super soldier Masterman. In an attempt to discredit the Destroyer, Masterman donned his costume and participated in an attack on British civilians. This scheme was uncovered by Union Jack and Spitfire, who arrived to rescue their old friend. Aubrey regained the Destroyer identity and subsequently battled an artificial stone soldier, the Sculpture. Funnily enough, it was Keen Marlow who reported the results of that battle over the radio in London. Marlow also continued operating as the Destroyer, although Florence disappeared sometime in 1942. While unconfirmed, it's been posited that perhaps she was killed after being exposed as the Destroyer's confidant. Aubrey, meanwhile, clashed with the demonic Nazi agent Madame Satan and her servant, a resurrected Attila the Hun. In early 1943, he traveled to Nazi-occupied France and helped smuggle captured rebels to freedom. It's likely that during one such trip, Aubrey encountered John Watkins, aka Citizen V, a costumed British soldier who led a band of freedom fighters in Nazi-occupied France known as the V Battalion. Unfortunately, Watkins was later led into a trap and killed by the notorious masked Nazi Baron Zemo. The rest of the V Battalion were subsequently hunted down and exterminated by Zemo's forces. One of the few survivors was Citizen V's lover, Paulette Brazy, who was pregnant with his child. Meanwhile, after several weeks in France, Roger Aubrey returned to Germany, aiding like-minded spies and saboteurs along the way. As for Keen Marlow, he helped destroy a Nazi munitions plant and saved a group of German freedom fighters. Marlow then fought alongside Frank Perod's Free French troops on the Swiss border, while Aubrey destroyed a Nazi force field generator in Germany and battled a legion of Hitler clones in Bavaria. Aubrey also aided British forces in the Netherlands, delivered Allied plans to the French resistance, and destroyed a magnetic weapon the Nazis used to repel aerial attacks. In 1944, Marlow decided that with Aubrey active in Europe, his strength could be put to better use elsewhere and relocated to Japan. There, he continued sabotaging Axis efforts, battling their agents, and aiding local allies. Aubrey, meanwhile, fought alongside an American hero known as the Blazing Skull in January of 1945. Of course, the Second World War would come to an end later that same year. On April 18th, Captain America and his partner Bucky were reported missing and presumed killed, following a final encounter with Baron Zemo. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler met his end at the fiery hands of another invader, the original Human Torch, Jim Hammond. This occurred during the Battle of Berlin, in which Soviet forces took the German capital, and Hitler's death was widely reported as a suicide. Brian and Jacqueline Falsworth stayed in Britain while the remaining invaders returned to America and were later reorganized into the All-Winners Squad. On August 6th, the United States detonated an atomic bomb over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second explosion targeted Nagasaki, with each bomb killing tens of thousands of civilians. On Sunday, September 2nd of 1945, Japan signed the final document of their unconditional surrender, effectively ending the war after 6 long and bloody years. Keen Marlow finally returned home to the United States, but he didn't want to give up being the destroyer. He started working at a private detective agency owned by Jerry Crane, an American lieutenant Marlow had met during the war. Alongside Crane's assistant, Kathy Dashiell, the destroyer solved a number of cases, but fell into obscurity after that, leaving some to question whether Marlow ever even existed. Roger Aubrey, meanwhile, returned to London to reunite with the Falsworths and aid in the reconstruction efforts. Together as the Destroyer, Union Jack, and Spitfire, the 3 British heroes joined forces with a Simkarian Nazi hunter, Ernst Sablanova, to track down escaped war criminals. Roger and Brian met the All-Winners Squad along with their new Captain America, Jeffrey Mace, and were inspired. In 1948, they gathered together a variety of veterans with the idea of starting an international fighting force to help maintain peace. While not everyone who was invited agreed with the idea, one who did was Paulette Brazy, who'd worked with the OSS following the death of her lover, Citizen V. And so in 1951, the V Battalion reactivated, operating out of Castle Masada in Simcaria. Paulette became the team's lead covert operative, assuming the mantle of Citizen V. Others involved included the Angel, Ms. America, the Iron Cross, the Silver Scorpion, the Whizzer, and former Howling Commando Reb Ralston. Roger Aubrey continued operating as the Destroyer and led the V Battalion on many missions. The Falsworths were deeply involved as well, but that changed in 1953 when Brian was killed in a car accident. Jacqueline retired from the group, and Montgomery, finally learning the nature of Roger's relationship with Brian, refused to pass the Union Jack identity on to him. Over the following decades, the V Battalion operated covertly, keeping the world safe while most were unaware of their existence. As time rolled on, many of the heroes who helped found the group retired, passed away, or moved on for various reasons. Despite this, the V Battalion not only remained strong, but actually expanded. With help from Howard Stark and Nathaniel Richards, they built a massive mobile headquarters, the Vanguard. The founders who remained and the descendants of those who left formed the organization's ruling body, the Penance Council. In 1981, as part of an ongoing investigation into a subversive organization known as the Everlasting, Roger Aubrey sought information on the deposed Sumerian god Marduk. He conferred with museum owner Zoltan Nestor, not realizing that Nestor was actually Marduk in disguise. Furthermore, when the two shook hands, Marduk touched Aubrey's soul, marking it for later. As the years passed and the Marvel Age arrived, new heroes emerged, while the V Battalion continued to go largely unnoticed. Thanks to his enhanced physiology, Aubrey maintained the vitality of a man half his age, allowing him to continue operating as head of the Penance Council. Meanwhile, the identity of Citizen V was meant to be passed on to John Watkins III, the grandson of the original. However, there was evidently an incident which resulted in him falling into a coma. Then, a few years later, a new superhero team emerged, led by a man who claimed to be Citizen V. In truth, this Citizen V was the son of Baron Zemo, the man who'd killed the original. His team, the Thunderbolts, were made up of supervillains posing as heroes, as part of a scheme to attain world domination. Initially, they succeeded in fooling the public, and a woman named Dallas Riordan was assigned to be their liaison to the New York mayor's office. When the Thunderbolts were exposed as villains, Riordan was disgraced, but then she was approached by Roger Aubrey. He revealed that her grandfather was in the original V Battalion and offered her the opportunity to become the new Citizen V. Riordan accepted, joining the V Battalion and clashing with Baron Zemo several times. Meanwhile, some of the Thunderbolts did indeed want to reform, and the team reorganized under the leadership of the Avenger Hawkeye. Following this, the Penance Council discovered that government agent Henry Peter Gyrich was plotting the death of every superhuman on Earth via nanoprobes. Not realizing that he was being manipulated by the Nazi war criminal Baron Wolfgang von Strucker, the Council ordered Citizen V to assassinate Gyrich. Unwilling to obey, Riordan fled to the Thunderbolts while the V Battalion pursued her. The whole situation ultimately resulted in Roger Aubrey suiting up as the Mighty Destroyer once again. During this time, Riordan was abducted by a criminal mastermind known as the Crimson Cowl and badly injured in the ensuing battle. Meanwhile, the Destroyer and the V Battalion's superhuman agents clashed with the Thunderbolts. However, the two teams soon joined forces to prevent the assassination of Symkaria's ruler, Silver Sable, the daughter of Aubrey's old ally Ernst Sablinova. After that, John Watkins III awakened from his 5-year coma and reclaimed his role as Citizen V. Although unbeknownst to Aubrey and the others, this happened because Watkins' body was being inhabited by Zemo's mind. Regardless, Gyrich's schemes were thwarted by him and the Thunderbolts, and Zemo subsequently disarmed Baron Strucker. He did try to usurp control of the nanoprobes for himself, but the Iron Cross, too old to live outside of his armor, sacrificed himself to disable them. Sometime later, Zemo's mind was expunged from Watkins' body due to largely accidental circumstances. After that, the V Battalion finally uncovered Marduk's plot to consume millions of souls and restore his godhood. Having already touched it decades prior, he was able to claim Roger Aubrey's soul from afar, effectively killing him. But even in death, he wouldn't stop fighting, and Aubrey manifested as the Destroyer within Marduk. Joining hands with other souls that had been collected over the centuries, the Destroyer led them to resist the Mad God. Thanks to Roger Aubrey and Citizen V, Marduk was defeated and the stolen souls were able to pass on to their appropriate afterlives. Roger's essence returned to his body, reviving him, and he subsequently retired, turning leadership of the V Battalion over to Jim Hammond, the ageless android who killed Adolf Hitler. Although for a man like Roger Aubrey, retirement tends not to last. When the world needed another hero or the V Battalion needed a leader, he would suit up once again as the Mighty Destroyer, willing to give his life for the greater good. But the question then remains, what happened to Keen Marlow? Well, as we mentioned earlier, one source indicates that he also continued operating as the Destroyer for decades, albeit in a series of largely undocumented adventures. He married a woman named Harriet, and the two had a daughter, Felicia, and granddaughter, Haley. Felicia's husband and Haley's father, Darius, was the Destroyer's former partner in danger, Turret. He retired that identity when he married Felicia, but put the costume on again 8 years later to save his wife from the Destroyer's old foe, Scar. At the same time, Marlow was getting older and his heart could no longer handle the strenuous tasks of superhero work, even with Schmidt's formula keeping him strong. In the end, Darius donned the costume and became the new Destroyer, but what, if anything, will come from that remains to be seen. But that's all I've got for you this week, and thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me, including my Patreon page where for only $1 a month you can get your name in these special thanks here, and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel. And if you made it this far in the video, be sure to let me know in the comments by letting me know which destroyer is your favorite. But that is indeed all I've got for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!